What if you could understand the entire skin, its layers, glands, hair, nail, and even the breasts? In this video, I have compiled the most important anatomy and function of the skin into one visual presentation you can follow step by step. First, we will answer a simple question. What is the integument? We will treat the skin as an organ in its own right and talk in detail about its function in protection, thermoregulation, immunity, vitamin D production, and so on. Then we will look at the surface patterns of the skin, the stuff you can see just by looking at your hand, like fingerprints and dermal ridges. After that, we will go into the layers of the skin and see what each layer is doing. Once we've done that, we will talk through the skin appendages, such as sweat and sebaceous glands, hair follicles, and nails. And finally, we will zoom out to the breasts and see how the mammary glands is built as a modified sweat gland. I will also throw in a few clinical notes along the way, and by the end, you should be able to look at your own skin and actually understand what you are seeing. What's up everyone? My name is Time. I'm a medical doctor and I make animated medical lectures to make different topics in medicine visually easier to understand. If you would like a PDF version or a quiz of this presentation, you can find it on my website, along with organized video lectures to help with your studies. Alright, let's start with that first question. What exactly is the integument? So when we say integument, we're not just talking about skin in the casual sense. In anatomy, the integumentary system is this whole outer covering of the body plus its accessories. That includes the skin with its layers, the hair, the nails, the sweat glands, the sebaceous glands, and in the chest region, the mammary glands as well. If you put all of that together, it's not a small structure either. In an average adult, it covers around 1.5 to 2 square meters and weighs several kilos, which makes it the largest organ of the body by area. Now, it helps to think of the skin the same way you would think of the liver or the heart. It's an organ with specific jobs, and every detail we go through later in this video will plug into one of these jobs. So before we cover any part of the skin, we will quickly make sense of what the integumentary system is doing for you all the time. First, protection is the most obvious one. The outer layer of the epidermis is full of keratinized dead cells that form a tough, waterproof barrier. These cells are packed into multiple layers with lipids between them. Because of that structure, mechanical forces such as rubbing or minor impacts are spread out over many layers instead of tearing through living tissue immediately. The lipid component slows down evaporation of water from the surface, so even though the air around you is often drier than the inside of the body, water does not just freely escape through the skin. We see how important this barrier is when it's lost. For example, in large burns, where fluid lost through the damaged skin can become life-threatening. The integument also contributes to protection against sunlight. Melanocytes in the deeper epidermis produces melanin, and this pigment absorbs part of the UV radiations that would otherwise damage DNA. The integument is also central for thermoregulation. In the dermis, there is a network of blood vessels that can dilate when you need to lose heat and constrict when you need to conserve it. When the vessels dilate, more warm blood is brought close to the surface, and because of that, heat is transferred to the environment, and the skin often looks redder and feels warm. Eccrine sweat glands then add another layer of control by secreting sweat onto the surface. When this sweat evaporates, it takes heat with it, which cools the skin and the blood flowing underneath. In cold conditions, the vessels constrict, so less blood reaches the surface, and that reduces the heat loss from the core to the environment. At the same time, the integument helps with water balance and a small amount of excretion. Sweat does not only contain water, it also carries sodium, chloride, and small amount of urea and other substances to the surface. If you sweat a lot without replacing fluid and electrolytes, you notice the consequences as thirst, dizziness, or muscle cramps. In the background, even when you're not visibly sweating, there is a small, continuous, insensible water loss through the skin, but the keratinized barrier keeps this within a narrow range. When that barrier is damaged, much more water can escape, which is one of the reasons why patients with excessive skin disease or burns can become dehydrated so quickly. The integument is also a very active part of the immune system. The physical barrier of the epidermis makes it difficult for bacteria, viruses, and fungi to enter in the first place. The surface of the skin is slightly acidic and is covered by a mixture of sweat and sebum that contains antimicrobial molecules. and it is colonized by a normal skin flora that competes with potential pathogens. Inside the epidermis, Langerhans cells move between the keratinocytes, pick up antigens that have managed to cross the surface, and carry them to regional lymph nodes to present them to T cells. In the dermis, you also find mast cells, macrophages, and lymphocytes ready to react, so the integument is constantly sampling the environment and feeding information to the immune system. One function that is easy to forget is its role in vitamin D metabolism. In the deeper layers of the epidermis, there is a cholesterol-related molecule called 7-dehydrocholesterol. When this part of the skin is exposed to UVB light from the sun, that energy changes the structure of 7-dehydrocholesterol into pre-vitamin D3, which then spontaneously become vitamin D, or cholecalciferol. This vitamin D enters the bloodstream and is then carried to the liver, where it is converted to 25-hydroxyvitamin D, and then to the kidneys, where it is converted into 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D, also called calcitriol. Calcitriol is the active form of vitamin D, which acts as a hormone that helps regulate calcium and phosphate balance and support normal bone mineralization. Studies on vitamin D status in different populations consistently show that low sun exposure or living at high latitude can lead to lower vitamin D levels, because the first step in that pathway depends on the skin seeing enough UVB. So in that sense, your integument is also the first organ in an endocrine chain. Finally, the integument is a huge sensory and communication surface. It contains 3 nerve endings that detect pain and temperature, and specialized receptors that detect light touch, pressure, and vibration. These receptors are especially dense in areas such as the fingertips and lips, which is why you can feel very small differences in texture and shape there. The skin also participates in non-verbal communication through changes in color and texture, such as blushing, paling, or getting goosebumps when arrector pili muscle contract in response to emotional or thermal stimuli. So those are the main functions of the skin. With that in place, we can now move from the overall definition to the first thing you actually see on your own skin, the surface patterns like fingerprints, ridges, and lines. If you look closely at the back of your hand in good light, you will see that the skin is not really smooth by nature. It is divided into tiny, almost rhomboid fields. The shallow grooves that border these fields are called skin sulci. Between them, you have small, slightly raised islands of skin, called skin areas. These areas look a bit swollen compared to the grooves because the collagen and elastic fibers in the dermis pull up on them from below. These sulci and areas are not random. In most regions, they form an irregular but recognizable patterns of small rhombs or polygons. This surface pattern reflects what is happening deeper in the dermis. In the reticular layer, we will look at this in more detail later, the thicker collagen bundles are not arranged as a chaotic tangle. They tend to run in preferred directions that vary from regions to region on the body. If you imagine connecting the long axis of many neighboring skin areas, you can trace out lines that follow this dominant direction of tension. These are the tension lines, also called cleavage lines or Langer's lines. Historically, Langer mapped these lines on cadavers by making small circular cuts on the skin and observing how the circles deformed. In most places, they stretched into ellipses, and by joining the long axis of these ellipses, he produced a map of the predominant collagen orientation in the dermis. In clinical practice, surgeons often try to place incisions along these lines, or at least parallel to the local patterns of the tension, because wounds that follow them usually heal with narrower, less conspicuous scars than cuts that cross them. On the surface, many natural skin folds line up with these directions of tension. For example, flexion grooves around joints, the creases on the palms, and several common facial and body wrinkles. With age, as elastic fibers degenerate, the skin loses some of its recoil. These folds deepen and new wrinkles tend to appear along the same lines. That is why facial wrinkles have fairly predictable orientations. Now, if you look at the palm, the patterns change. Instead of a fine net of rhomboid areas, you see long ridges running in arcs and loops. These are dermal ridges or papillary ridges. They correspond to large dermal papillae that is projected up into the epidermis, especially in thick skin regions like the palms and soles. The overlying epidermis follow these ridges and grooves, and together they form the fingerprints and footprints that are unique to each person. The reason these ridges are so prominent here is partially mechanical and partially functional. Mechanically, they improve grip by increasing friction between the skin and whatever you are holding or standing on, and functionally, they increase the surface area available for sensory receptors and sweat pores. Many of the tactile receptors in the dermis sit very close to these ridges, so when you touch an object, tiny differences in texture and pressure are translated into small distortions along the ridges, which are then picked up by the receptors beneath. At several points on the palm, the ridge's skin form low, rounded pads at the tips of the fingers, between the base of the fingers, and in the pads at the base of the thumb and the little finger. These pads are called tactile elevations. They are areas where the palm skin is a bit thicker and packed with sensory nerve endings, so they are the main contact zones when you press or grip objects. So now that we have looked at the surface patterns, let's start moving down through the layers themselves and see how the skin is built from the outside in. So let us cover the layers of the skin now. When you take a cross section of the skin, you can divide it into three main parts: the epidermis at the top, the dermis underneath, and then a deeper subcutaneous tissue, or hypodermis, that blends into the fat and fascia of the body. Each of these has its own structure and its own job, so we will take them one by one, and we will start with the epidermis. The epidermis is a stratified squamous keratinized epithelium. That basically means it is made of several layers of flat cells, and the cells at the surface are packed with keratin and have lost their nuclei. If we start at the bottom and work our way up, the first layer you meet is the basal layer. This is a single layer of mostly cuboid cells sitting on the basement membrane. These basal cells are mitotically active, so they keep dividing and pushing new cells upwards. It also contains melanocytes and Merkel cells, which we will get back to in a moment. Just above that is the spinous layer. Under the microscope, the cells here look like they have little spines or prickles between them. These spines are actually desmosomes, which are junctions that link the cells together. As the basal cells move up into this layer, they start producing more keratin and become slightly larger and flatter. Above the spinosum lies the granular layer. The cells here are flatter again and contain dark keratohyalin granules. These granules are full of proteins that later help bundle the keratin filaments together. At the same time, the cells start to release lipid-rich content from the lamellar granules into the spaces between them. Those lipids act like a seal between the cells, which is an important part of why the surface of the skin is water resistant. So in this layer, the cell is basically preparing to die in a very organized way. And at the same time, it is helping build the barrier that stops water and many substances from passing freely across the epidermis. In thick skin, like on the palms and soles, you then see a thin, pale layer called the stratum lucidum. The cells here have lost their nuclei and organelles, and they look clear and homogeneous in histological sections. Not all textbooks emphasize this layer in thin skin, but in thick skin, it is a clear transitional zone between the granular layer and the fully keratinized surface. On top of that, you have the stratum corneum. This is a stack of dead, flattened cells packed with keratin embedded in lipids. There are no nuclei, no organelles, and no active metabolism here. The combination of stiff keratin and intercellular lipids give this layer its toughness and its low permeability. When you rub on your skin or when you wash your hands, you are mostly interacting with this dead corneum, not with living tissue underneath. The very outmost sheets of the corneum, which are in the process of flaking off, are sometimes referred to as the stratum disjunctum. These are the cells that are just about to shed into the environment. Now, within these layers, you don't just have one type of cell. The majority are keratinocytes. They are born in the basal layer, gradually move upwards, accumulate keratin, lose their nuclei, and finally get shed to the surface. This constant turnover is what allows the skin to renew itself and repair minor damage. Mixed in with them, especially at the basal layer, are melanocytes. These cells make melanin in melanosomes and transfer these pigment granules into surrounding keratinocytes. Inside these keratinocytes, the melanin tends to sit like a cap over the nuclei and absorb UV radiation, which help protect the DNA in that cell from UV-induced damage. The number of melanocytes is fairly similar between individuals. Most of the visible differences in skin colors comes from how much melanin they produce and how it is packed. Also in the epidermis, you find Langerhans cells. These are dendritic cells that come from the bone marrow. They move between keratinocytes in the spinosum and other layers, sampling antigens that get into the epidermis. When they pick up something suspicious, they can migrate to local lymph nodes and present these antigens to lymphocytes, which links the skin to the adaptive immune system. In the basal layer, especially in areas of fine touch like the fingertips, you also find Merkel cells. These are cells that sit in close contact with afferent nerve endings, forming what are called Merkel discs. Under the epidermis lies the dermis. The dermis is made of connective tissue rather than epithelium. It contains the bulk of the skin's collagen and elastic fibers, the capillary networks that feed the epidermis, most of the sensory receptors, and the deeper parts of the hair follicles and glands. We usually split it into two layers, the papillary layer on top and the reticular layer beneath. The papillary layer sits just under the epidermis. It is made of looser connective tissue with thin collagen and elastic fibers. It forms small projections called dermal papillae that push up into the underside of the epidermis. Where these papillae are especially large and regularly arranged, they form dermal part of the ridges you see as fingerprints and the ridged pattern on the palms and soles. Inside these papillae, you find capillary loops that supply oxygen and nutrition to the avascular epidermis, and you often find Meissner's corpuscles and other touch receptors here as well. So this layer is important for both nourishing the epidermis and for creating a fine surface pattern and tactile sensitivity of the skin. Deeper down is the reticular layer. This is thicker and denser. The collagen fibers here are larger and form a network of bundles that intersect and loop around, creating a mesh that gives the skin much of its tensile strength. These bundles are not orientated randomly. They have preferred directions depending on the regions of the body, which is what we saw earlier as tension lines or Langer's lines at the surface. Elastic fibers woven through these collagen network give the skin some ability to stretch and then recoil. Within the reticular dermis, you find the roots of hair follicles, sebaceous glands, the secretory coils of sweat glands, larger blood vessels, and many of the deeper sensory receptors. When you get a deep cut that reaches this layer, you are most likely to damage these structures and to create a scar, because you are disrupting the main supporting framework of the skin. Below the dermis, the connective tissue gradually becomes looser and starts to accumulate more fat. This is a subcutaneous tissue, the hypodermis. The hypodermis is composed mainly of adipose tissue with a thickness that varies a lot between the body regions and between individuals. It tends to be thickest in areas like the abdomen, buttocks, and thighs, where it serves as an energy store, a cushion, and an insulating layer. Running from the dermis down through the subcutaneous tissue to the deep fascia, you find strands of connective tissue called skin ligaments. Where these ligaments are short and strong, like in the palm, the skin is tightly anchored and hardly moves over the underlying structures. Where they are longer and more lax, the skin can glide more freely, like over the back of the hand. In some locations, especially over the bony prominence such as the elbow or patella, you can also find small subcutaneous synovial bursae. These are fluid-filled sacs that reduce friction between the skin and the bones when the joints move or when there is pressure from outside. Now that we have built the layers of the skin, the next step is to look at what is actually connected to this wall. The skin is not just a flat sheet of tissue. It has a whole set of appendages that grow out from it and sit inside it. The sweat glands, the sebaceous glands, the hair, and the nails. All of these develop from the epidermis, and they extend down into the dermis and sometimes into the hypodermis, and they are a big part of how the integument does its job. We will start with the sweat glands. The most common type is the eccrine sweat gland. Under the microscope, each eccrine gland looks like a simple coiled tube. The secretory portion is a tight ball of tubules deep in the dermis or upper hypodermis, and from that ball, a straight duct runs up through the dermis and epidermis and opens directly onto the skin surface as tiny pores. These glands are scattered almost everywhere on the body, but they are especially dense on the palms, soles, and forehead. The fluid they produce is a thin, watery sweat made mostly of water with sodium, chloride, small amounts of potassium, urea, and other solutes. The second main type is the apocrine sweat glands. These glands are also coiled tubular glands, but they are larger, sit deeper, and instead of opening directly onto the skin, they usually empty into the upper part of the hair follicles. They are present at birth, but do not become fully active until puberty when they are influenced by androgens. The secretion they produce is more viscous than eccrine sweat and contain proteins and lipids. On its own, it has a little smell, but when skin bacteria break down its components on the surface, they produce volatile compounds that give body odor. These glands are mainly under adrenergic sympathetic control and tend to respond to emotional stress as well as thermal stimuli, which is why people often notice dampness and odor in the axilla during anxiety or embarrassment even if the rest of the body is not particularly warm. Several other glands can be thought of as modified sweat glands that have specialized for local tasks. The mammary glands, which we will cover in more detail later, is especially a highly developed modified apocrine gland in the anterior thoracic wall that produces milk. There are other modified apocrine glands as well, like around the areola that helps lubricate and protect the nipple during breastfeeding. In the eyelids, along the lash margins, there are ciliary glands. Inflammation of these can produce stye. In the external acoustic meatus, you have ceruminous glands that produce cerumen, or earwax, which protects the canal. In the nasal vestibule, there are small nasal sweat glands. All of these variations are adapted to the needs of a particular region. Running alongside the sweat glands are the sebaceous glands that look like a cluster of small units, or acini, that open into a short duct. The cells in the acini fill up with lipids and then disintegrate, releasing their content into the duct. Because the entire cell is sacrificed to deliver the secretion, this is called a holocrine type of secretion. Most sebaceous glands are attached to hair follicles and empty into the follicular canal. From there, the oily mixture, called sebum, spreads over the surface of the skin and along the hair shaft. Sebum contains triglycerides, wax esters, squalene, and some breakdown products, and it helps to lubricate the skin and hair, reduce water loss from the surface, and provide a hydrophobic barrier. There are also free sebaceous glands that open directly onto the skin without a hair follicle. You see them, for example, on the lips or at the margin of the eyelids. Sebaceous activity increases under the influence of androgens at puberty, which is one reason acne tend to flare up at that time. When the duct of sebaceous gland become blocked, sebum can accumulate and form comedones or cysts. If we look at hair next, each hair is built as an organ in its own, right? It starts with a hair follicle. At the base of this follicle is an expanded region called the hair bulb. Pushing up into the base of the bulb from below is a projection of dermal connective tissue called the dermal papillae. This papillae carries capillaries and connective tissue that supply the growing hair matrix cells with nutrition and signaling molecules. As matrix cells divide and move upwards, they differentiate, fill with hard keratin, and form the shaft of the hair, much like keratinocytes in the epidermis, but in more focused cylindrical arrangement. The part of the hair you can see above the skin is the hair shaft. Inside the skin, the portion from the surface down to the bulb is called the hair root. You can also see an outer cortex, and in many hairs, a central medulla. The cortex contains densely packed keratinized cells with pigment granules, which gives the hair its color. The medulla, when present, is made of more loosely arranged cells and air spaces. Attached to the sides of each follicle is a small, smooth muscle called the arrector pili muscle. One end is fixed to the dermis, and the other end attaches to the connective tissue sheath of the follicle. When this muscle contracts, it pulls the hair into more vertical position and causes a slight depression of the skin surface on one side, which makes the surrounding area bulge up. This is what you see as goosebumps. In furry animals, this mechanism increases the thickness of the insulating air layer trapped in the coat. In humans, it has less physiological importance, but it is still part of the sympathetic fight or flight response and of thermoregulatory reflexes. Finally, the third major appendage is the nail. A nail is a specialized plate of hard keratin that sits on a modified patch of skin. The visible part of the nail is a nail body or nail plate. It has two lateral borders which are tucked into shallow grooves formed by the surrounding skin, and a free border distally which grows over the tip of the finger or toe. Proximally, the nail plate extends under the skin fold. The portion of the nail hidden under this fold is a nail root. Deep to the root lies the nail matrix. This is a region of proliferating cells that actually produce the nail. As these matrix cells divide and keratinize, they push the older cells distally, and that slow, continuous movement is what causes the nail to grow forward. The pale half-moon shaped area you see at the base of some nails is the luneole, which is the superficial part of the matrix shining through a slightly opaque overlying plate. The skin around the nail forms the proximal and lateral nail folds. At the proximal end, where the skin overlaps at the base of the nail plate, the epidermis forms a thin cuff called the eponychium. This is what people often call the cuticle. It helps protect the newly formed nail as it emerges from the matrix. Distally, under the free edge of the nail, the skin is called the hyponychium. Beneath the nail plate itself lies the nail bed. This is a specialized dermis with a rich capillary network that gives the nail its pink color, where the plate is thin and translucent. Because the nail bed is so vascular and the plate is relatively transparent, the nail can act as a quick visual window to assess peripheral perfusion and oxygenation, for example by looking at the capillary refill or at changes in color in hypoxia. Now that we have covered the main skin appendages, I want to zoom out for a moment and look at one special structure that is built on the same principles, the breast. The breast is a specialized area of skin and subcutaneous tissue that contains a modified apocrine gland called the mammary gland, together with fat and connective tissue. So even though we often think of it as its own organ, it is still part of the integumentary system. On the surface, we can see two landmarks, the areola, which is the circular pigmented skin around the nipple, and the nipple, which is basically a small projection containing the openings of the lactiferous ducts. When the smooth muscle in the nipple and the areola contracts, for example in response to cold or stimulation during breastfeeding, the nipple becomes more prominent and firmer, which help the infant latch on. Scattered in the areolar skin, you can see small bumps called the areolar glands. These are modified sebaceous and sweat glands that secrete an oily protective fluid on the surface. That secretion helps lubricate the nipple and the areola and may also have a role in scent cues during breastfeeding. Deep to this surface, the mammary gland itself is arranged into lobes and lobules embedded in a background of fat. In a typical adult breast, there are about 15 to 20 lobes of glandular tissue. Each lobe is made up of many smaller lobules, and each lobule contains clusters of secretory units called alveoli. The epithelial cells in the alveoli are the ones that actually produces the milk during lactation. Around them sits myoepithelial cells that can contract and help squeeze the milk out. From each lobe, the small ducts draining the alveoli join to form a single, larger lactiferous duct. These ducts converge towards the nipple, and just before they reach it, each one widens slightly into a lactiferous sinus, and then narrows again to open on the nipple surface. When the breast is not active, for example before pregnancy, the glandular component is relatively small and much of the volume is fat. During pregnancy and lactation, the glandular elements proliferate and the alveoli enlarge, so the proportion of the glandular tissue increases and the breast becomes fuller and heavier. Holding all of this together is a framework of connective tissue called the suspensory ligaments of the breast. These are fibrous bands that run from the dermis of the overlying skin down through the breast tissue to the deeper pectoral fascia. They divide the breast into lobes and help maintain its general shape and position on the chest wall. Because they connect the gland to the skin, any processes that pull on them, such as a fibrotic tumor, they can cause dimpling or puckering of the overlying skin, which is one of the classical clinical signs you look for on breast examination. And with that, we have now covered the detailed anatomy of the skin and its appendages, from the basic layers and surface patterns to glands, hair, nails, and even the breast. I really hope you found that helpful. I've made free courses for other topics here on YouTube if you want to keep learning. Otherwise, if you want a handmade PDF version of this lecture, take a quiz to test your knowledge, or access an organized list of all my videos, you can find everything on my website. Thanks for watching, see you in the next one.